When my mother passed away, something inside the house fractured. Not the walls, not the furniture, but something deeper. Something threaded through every floorboard and every quiet space. Something you couldn't fix with new paint or fresh flowers. Something you could only feel pressing against your ribs in the dark hours of the night. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The way the air seemed heavier, harder to breathe, as if the house itself mourned. The way the stairs creaked louder beneath my feet. The way every clock ticked with a slightly frantic urgency, as though the minutes themselves were running away from something. I moved back in a week after the funeral. At first, it was supposed to be temporary, just until he could find his footing again. Just until the worst of the grief loosened its grip. Just until... I didn't finish the sentence. Because some part of me already understood, you don't come back to a place drowning in memory and expect to leave untouched. The first night back, I slept in my old bedroom. The posters of forgotten bands still clung stubbornly to the walls, pale with age. The dresser still carried the faint scent of lavender and old wood polish, a ghost of Saturday mornings spent under my mother's careful hands. But the feeling wasn't the same. The house was cold in places it should have been warm. The rooms echoed more than they should have, answering back with a hollowness that didn't belong. It felt like living inside a shadow, trapped between someone else's memory and your own fading reflections. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just settle around you, it pours into you, heavy and cold, until you forget what sound even feels like. I found excuses to stay busy. I reorganized the pantry. I dusted shelves that had no dust. I washed laundry that barely filled the machine. Because if I stopped moving, if I let the silence catch me, I didn't know if I would be able to outrun it again. And him, my stepfather, he moved through the days like a ghost tied to the house. He barely spoke. He barely ate. Sometimes I would find him slumped in the dark living room, the television throwing colors across his face in strange, broken patches. I told myself it was grief. Of course it was grief. What else could hollow a person out like that? Some nights, I heard him call out in his sleep, her name, half-formed, a fragile echo clawing at the walls. I would lie awake, tracing the cracks across the ceiling, counting each breath, each sob, each whispered plea. Other nights, the house drowned in silence, so complete it felt like a second kind of death. And then there were the gestures, not touches, exactly, but small anchors tossed into the widening space between us. A hand brushing my shoulder when I set a plate in front of him. Fingers briefly brushing as I handed him a coffee mug. A hand resting at my back, more for balance than intention, as I leaned into the fridge. At first, I told myself it was grief reaching out blindly. Grief makes you reach for anything warm, anything steady. Neither of us was thinking too clearly. But sometimes I would catch him looking at me not with recognition, but with a lostness so raw it was almost unbearable. His gaze would hover for a second too long, catching not on who I was, but on the shape of absence that now filled the house. And I would feel it. That ache. That invisible heaviness. The silent acknowledgement of two people both searching for the same impossible thing. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, standing by the window, bathed in the last dying gold of the sun. He held one of my mother's teacups, cradling it absently, staring through it as if searching for something he could never retrieve. I froze at the doorway, uncertain whether to enter or retreat. He turned slowly, and our eyes met. And for a fleeting, brutal second, we were not stepfather and daughter. We were just two broken souls in a house that had lost its center. Two survivors clinging to pieces that didn't fit anymore. My throat closed up. I looked away first, feigning distraction with a dishcloth, my hands clumsy with the tremble I couldn't quite hide. He said nothing, just lowered the teacup with a carefulness that made my chest ache and walked out of the room without another glance. I stood there long after he left, listening to the thrum of the refrigerator and the anxious ticking of the old clock, trying to convince myself that nothing had shifted, though every breath I took knew otherwise. The days began to melt into each other after that. The house settled into a rhythm that felt both too fragile and too binding to touch. He started waiting up for me when I returned from errands. Started inviting me to sit with him, not with words, but with the soft pull of expectation that wrapped around every quiet evening. And every time, I found myself sinking into the offered silence. We watched old television shows we didn't really care about. Shared meals where every flavor tasted like dust and longing. Sometimes we didn't even speak at all, simply sitting together, two figures stitched together by grief and habit. But it wasn't the silence that unnerved me. It was the glances. The heavy, lingering looks across the room that felt like questions we didn't dare ask. It was the briefest brushes of hands when passing a bowl, the way neither of us moved quite fast enough anymore. It was the smiles he sometimes gave, small, sad, the smiles of someone holding a memory too tightly. The smiles of someone remembering a life that no longer belonged to him. And worse still, it was the way I smiled back. Because some part of me, the part that had been hollowed out by years of neglect and loneliness, reached for that smile like a drowning person reaching for air. It made me feel visible again. It made me remember what it felt like to be needed, or at least not forgotten. And it had been so unbearably long since anyone had looked at me with anything but absence. One night, the storm broke over the house like a living thing. The wind screamed, the rain hammered the roof, the windows rattled in their frames. I lit candles and carried them into the living room, their small, shivering flames pushing back the darkness. He sat hunched on the couch, his elbows braced against his knees, his eyes distant, staring at the flickering light like it held answers he had forgotten how to ask for. I handed him a blanket. Our fingers brushed, and for a long, trembling heartbeat, neither of us moved. We stood in the charged hush of the room, breathing, not touching, but closer than we should have been. Closer than was safe. His gaze met mine, searching my face for something I didn't know how to give. And in that thin, breaking moment, I saw the weight he carried. The endless, impossible weight of grief. The sorrow neither of us could name without shattering the fragile peace between us. I dropped my gaze first, muttered something about the storm, sank onto the couch beside him, leaving enough space that the empty air between us could stretch and strain, but not quite snap. I forced myself not to notice how near he was, how the heat of him seeped across the few inches of fabric and space. I forced myself to pretend I didn't feel the pull, the ache, the desperate human need for something solid in a world that kept dissolving under my feet. Because pretending was the only way the house could keep standing. The only way we both could keep standing. After that night when the storm tore through the town and the house groaned beneath the rage of the wind, after the flicker of candles died into darkness and the silence wrapped itself tighter around the walls, something between us shifted. Not shattered all at once, but split softly, like the first fragile thread snapping in a shirt worn thin by too many years. Something familiar, aching, irreplaceable. At first, it showed itself in the mornings. I would come down the stairs, my robe hastily knotted at the waist, bare feet chilled by the old wooden steps, and find him already at the kitchen table. 2 mugs of coffee would be waiting, one cupped in his hands, the other pushed forward across the table, like a silent offering, like an unspoken prayer. I would take the cup, our fingers brushing briefly, barely a whisper of contact, and neither of us would mention it. Neither of us would flinch. Because the air between us had thickened into something harder to name, something breathing, something alive and trembling, and we both understood, without ever speaking it aloud, that acknowledging it might tear the fragile world we had built to pieces. The days after blurred together. Slow, syrup thick, heavy with a tension we danced around but never fully faced. He started noticing things no one else had noticed in years. The way I chewed the inside of my cheek when I was anxious. The way I tucked a stray strand of hair behind my ear when I was thinking too hard. The faint quiver in my voice when I lied about small things, meals skipped, hours of restless sleep. And worse, I noticed him noticing. I felt it like a tremor every time I crossed the room, the way his gaze lingered longer than it should have, weighted down with a sadness too complicated to untangle. The way his footsteps slowed, when he neared a doorway where I stood, as though caught between the impulse to flee and the desperate desire to stay. The way his voice dropped slightly when he spoke my name, wrapping it in a tired, broken tenderness that made my chest tighten in ways I didn't want to admit. I started changing too, though I told myself it was nothing, that it was grief. That it was the desperate gravity of two lonely planets circling the same dead star. I started wearing softer clothes, fabrics that clung more gently to my skin, that whispered rather than clung. I started leaving my bedroom door not quite closed at night, a slice of muted light bleeding into the hallway. I moved slower, giving space, giving presence, tiny, dangerous invitations I pretended not to see for what they were. Each choice felt like dropping a pebble into a glassy pond, each ripple moving outward, each one pulling us a fraction closer across a silence we could barely contain. One night, I couldn't have said which anymore. The days had blurred into one heavy, humming stretch of ache. I couldn't sleep. The sheets tangled around my legs, the heat of my own restless body pressing down until I thought I might suffocate under it. I crept downstairs, barefoot, wrapped in a sweater worn soft and thin by too many years. It barely brushed my thighs, the hem frayed like a memory rubbed too often between trembling fingers. I hadn't expected him to be there, but he was, sitting hunched on the living room couch, the muted flicker of the television painting his face in pale shades of blue and gold. His head was bowed, his body curled inward like someone trying to become smaller than his own grief would allow. I froze in the doorway, the breath punched out of me by the weight of the sight. Something in the way he sat, still, broken, crumbling, made my chest ache with a sharp, unbearable longing for something I didn't have a name for. I should have turned around, should have gone back upstairs, closed the door, pretended I hadn't seen. But I didn't. I moved toward him, slow, careful steps, like approaching a wild animal unsure whether to flee or attack, and sat down at the far end of the couch, leaving a stretch of empty space between us so thin it might have been a lifetime. The cushions dipped under my weight. The air trembled between us. He lifted his head, and our eyes met across that too small distance. And there it was again. That terrible, beautiful, unspeakable thing. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The silence stretched between us, thick and pulsing, louder than the muted television, louder than the rain still whispering against the windows, louder than the guilt pressing into the hollows of my chest. Then slowly, so slowly it hurt, he shifted closer. Not touching, not reaching, just moving closer, as though pulled by a tide neither of us could resist. Our hands brushed, not deliberate, not accidental, but something in between. Fingers grazing, lingering. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. I let our hands rest together in the dimness, our breathing shallow and uneven, as though both of us were afraid even oxygen might snap the fragile stillness. For a long, endless moment, minutes, hours, lifetimes, we sat like that, silent, broken, waiting, and inside the wreckage of that silence, something opened in me, a crack, so wide it felt like it might swallow me whole. A hollow place where loneliness had lived too long, now filled with something sharp and blinding and terrifying. Because it wasn't just comfort we were reaching for anymore. It wasn't just grief we were trying to soothe. It was the desperate, aching hunger to be seen fully, truly, after so long spent fading quietly away. And some reckless, ragged part of me, the part that had long since forgotten how to be anything but invisible, answered back. Not with words, not with sense, only with the broken, starving echo of need. The next morning, we said nothing. But the air between us was different, heavier, sharper, vibrating with all the things we hadn't dared name. It was no longer a question of if. It wasn't even a question of when. It was already happening. It had already begun. And we were both too far gone to stop it. The night it all fell apart, the house seemed to breathe with us, every wall, every floorboard, every trembling window pane shivering beneath the weight of something unspoken. The air itself felt alive, thick and pulsing, humming with the grief and loneliness that had been building for weeks, a slow, sick gravity that pulled at us with every silent dinner, every hollow glance, every moment of aching stillness that stretched too far. It was late, far too late for visitors, too late for reason or distance or anything resembling self-preservation. I was in the kitchen, barefoot again, wrapped in an old, threadbare nightshirt that clung more to memory than to modesty. I pretended to be looking for tea, my fingers trailing absently over the rows of jars and dusty boxes, though really I was hiding from him, from myself, from the inevitable. I heard his footsteps behind me, soft, uncertain, almost reluctant, and something inside me clenched tight. Couldn't sleep? He asked, voice rough and low, the words brushing the air between us like a warning. I didn't turn around right away. My hands gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles ached, focusing on the simple mechanics of breathing, in, out, pretending it mattered. Pretending it could save me. Storm's coming, I said finally, my voice a breath of nothing against the growing noise inside my own head. He moved closer, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the shape of him behind me, the weight of everything we weren't saying filling the narrow space between us. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut against the rush of fear, of sorrow, of certainty. You don't have to be alone tonight, he said, so softly I barely heard it, felt it more like a tremor running along my spine. And maybe in another version of this life, I would have turned away. Maybe in another story, I would have laughed awkwardly, mumbled some excuse, climbed the stairs, and buried myself under cold sheets. But not here. Not now. Not in this hollow house where the dead clung to the walls and the living clung to each other, trying to survive their own ghosts. I turned to face him. Slowly, deliberately. And what I saw in his eyes, raw, broken, desperate, shattered the last defenses I had so carefully built inside myself. It wasn't lust. It wasn't romance. It was need. Human and terrible and overwhelming. The primal need to be seen, to be known, to be remembered. He lifted a hand, hesitated, and then, with a gentleness that nearly undid me, brushed his knuckles against my cheek, a touch so light it might have been imagined. I froze, not pulling away, not moving closer, caught in the silent earthquake, splitting my world open. For one suspended moment, it felt like the whole house leaned with us, waiting. But nothing more happened. The space between us stayed charged, unbearable, but we didn't cross it fully. Some thin, invisible line held, just barely, keeping the world from collapsing. I stepped back first, the spell breaking like thin ice underfoot. Murmured something meaningless about the hour, the storm, the tea forgotten on the counter. He nodded once and retreated a step as well, his face a careful mask over the storm I knew raged inside him. We parted without another word, the house settling around us with a groan, the walls sighing like old bones remembering too much. The morning after felt sharper, colder. I woke early, my body stiff, my chest heavy with things I couldn't name. I stood under the icy spray of the shower, trying to wash away a weight that had nothing to do with skin and everything to do with sorrow. I moved through the house like a ghost, dressing, making coffee, avoiding reflections. When he finally appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, eyes tired and searching, I couldn't meet his gaze. The shame was too raw, the grief too loud. He crossed the kitchen carefully, like approaching a wounded animal. Reached out, a tentative hand brushing the air near my shoulder, but I flinched without meaning to, pulling back before he could touch. His face crumpled, just for a moment, before he tucked his hands into his pockets and turned away. He started, but the words crumbled on his tongue. Don't, I said, sharper than I intended, the words slicing the air between us. Because if he spoke, if he tried to soften it, if he tried to explain, I might have shattered all over again. Because it had been a mistake. God help us both, it had been a mistake. No matter how it had felt in the moment, pure, necessary, a desperate gasp in a drowning sea, it was a mistake forged out of loss, not love. The days after were a slow death. We became strangers orbiting the same ruined space, pretending, failing. Every glance another cut, every silence another howl. He tried, sometimes clumsy jokes at breakfast, forced questions about my errands, but we both knew it was too late. The rot had already set in. I moved out 3 weeks later. I packed my life into boxes, quick, efficient, like closing up a crime scene. I didn't tell anyone the real reason. I barely told myself. He didn't try to stop me. He just stood there, fists clenched, lips moving around words he would never find, as I walked past him carrying the last pieces of what had once been my home. Because some ruins can't be rebuilt. Some wounds don't bleed. They fester. Slowly, quietly, until you don't even notice the infection anymore, only the hollow spaces where something living used to be. I found a small apartment across town, cold, functional, anonymous. Filled it with furniture from discount stores and promises I didn't believe. I told people I needed a fresh start. I told myself I had survived worse. But every night, when the lights dimmed and the silence pressed close, I could still feel it. That terrible,